Okay, part 3 of chapter 4, starting with the cognitive perspective on page 108 and going up through the competition model and language and the brain on page 13. The cognitive perspective, this is bringing us up into the 1990s, fairly recently. And one thing we haven't talked much about is neurobiology, which is the brain. Which part of the brain handles language processing? People talk a lot about, well, traditionally the left side of the brain was supposed to be for language because it's logical, and the right side of the brain is more creative. But we have found that because language learning involves both logic and feelings and creativity, that language is that both parts of the brain are involved with language learning. Is there a specific place in your brain that handles language? And it seems that there is, because people who have brain damage from an accident, a lot of times they lose their language ability based on like which part of the brain was damaged. But I don't know of an actual area in the brain that handles language. I know with young children that they can have a brain injury, but of course their brain's so flexible that like other parts of the brain can take up the language learning ability as well. But we mentioned before that in the cognitive perspective that the LAD is not really required, and language learning is classified the same as just anything else that we learn. And when we get input, we categorize it in our computer, and we make rules, and we generalize those rules to other things. Going to information processing on page 108, this almost makes me feel like we're going back to the learning model as opposed to the acquiring model. Now it seems like we're going back to this idea that we work hard to learn language step by step as opposed to just kind of picking it up. But there are some things to be learned from this. One term is declarative knowledge, which becomes procedural knowledge. So declarative knowledge is just like a rule that you know and you can explain, but it doesn't become procedural knowledge until you actually know how to use the language. It's kind of like passive, to me it was similar to the passive versus active knowledge of, for example, a word, where passive knowledge is you understand the word, but active is that you know kind of all the different types of contexts that you would actually use that word. And another term that's kind of interesting is, well, language development or learning can happen not really slowly on a slant, but it seems to happen more like it plateaus and then it jumps up real quick, and then it might even go down a little bit. If you've ever heard someone say, like, I think my language is getting worse, before it gets better, if you're fatigued or something or burned out. So the learning model tends to be kind of in bursts of improvement, which is termed here restructuring. I haven't really heard that term used before for that, but I've definitely heard of learning being kind of plateauing and jumping. In fact, one interesting phenomenon is that sometimes you can study a language very intensively and then take a break for a quarter or even 9 months or a year, and when you go back to studying that language, you've improved, just because it's like your brain had to absorb all that information somehow, and subconsciously, like, you were still learning the language somehow, and so when you come back to it after taking a break, sometimes it's improved without even really focusing on it that much. The TAP, T-A-P, I haven't really heard that term used as much before, transfer appropriate processing, and I haven't heard that term, but I have heard the principle, which is that wherever you learn something, well, sometimes you learn something in a certain context, or even a certain classroom, and later when you take the test in another room or another context, it's hard to remember. And so people like to kind of take tests in the same room that they learned everything in, or even like the same chair. And that applies to language learning, that if you're trying to remember language, sometimes it's hard when you're, for example, you learned a lot of language in a classroom, and now when you're outside of the classroom, well, you could say that is a different context to try to remember things. Unfortunately, sometimes that makes people think that if you're coming up against like a big grammar test, then your language class should have a lot of grammar instruction, because the test is going to have a lot of grammar on it. And we start teaching to that test. So the classroom activities, if you try to do a lot of communicative activities, the student might feel like this isn't going to help me with this giant grammar test I have, like to get into a university or an international language test. And as far as usage-based learning, this is on page 110. Again, the focus here on, we've talked about frequency, but an emphasis here on what is referred to as a network of associations. So you begin to associate certain words with certain nouns with certain verbs, or certain verbs with certain prepositions, like all the phrasal verbs, like to come in, go out, stand up, sit down. And pretty soon you're creating this network of associations so that all these words and structures come together, including different situations. And again, just focusing on that you're learning by using the language. And we often talk about, in language, we don't really use language like word by word, but more like phrase by phrase, or sometimes we call it like chunking, so that we put words in like chunks, and we think of them like, hey, what's going on? Like that's like a chunk. Or, how you doing? As opposed to like, how are you doing? We just think of it as this chunk of language. And oh my God, or like even phrases like that. And so language can be seen as a series of thought groups. Sometimes we refer to them as thought groups. So even if I say a whole sentence like, yesterday I called my friend, but he wasn't home, so I decided to just stay home. So really, it's kind of like yesterday is one thought group. Then I called my friend is the thought group. He wasn't home. So it's almost like those clauses or sentences become language units. Okay, so that's the end of part 3.